is Robert Boyd. I am a member of the South Surrey White Rock Writers Group, and I'm going to be reading an excerpt from one of my short stories, novellas, which will be part of my anthology series of stories about life on the prairies. It is called Last Train to Hammersmith. May 1998. Daryl Kersley arrived at the CP Rail dispatch office in Weyburn, Saskatchewan at 7 o'clock a.m. Daryl, a CP Rail engineer, regularly drove the Weyburn tramp along the 95-kilometer Hammersmith subdivision. When he entered the office, his brakeman, Charlie Wilson, was already there. "What'd you do? Sleep in?" asked Charlie jokingly. "What are you talking about? I'm here on time," replied Daryl. "Hey, I'm just kidding. Besides, what does it matter?" A half hour later, Richard Jennings, the dispatcher, finishes typing Daryl's orders. He hands the sheet to Daryl and says in a somber tone, "Well, guess this is it." Daryl offered no reply. He merely took the sheet, and him and Charlie left the office and headed to their locomotive, which was parked at the far end of the rail yard. Normally, this will be a routine run, but today's run will be anything but ordinary. It is the final train which will run on this rail line. Daryl and Charlie climbed into the cab of the GP38 locomotive, which dated from the mid-70s. GP38s were still popular on the branch lines as they were lighter in weight. Daryl seemed apprehensive to open the throttle. "Let's just get this over with. You knew this day would come sooner or later," said Charlie. The writing was on the walls. The Hammersmith subdivision had been seeing a decline in revenue over the past 10 years. Low commodity prices meant less grain being grown, which meant fewer rail cars being loaded. In that time frame, a total of 7 grain elevators in the 4 towns located along the rail line closed. It seems that the current generation have less interest in carrying on the family farm. They want to move away and pursue other ventures. When the abolition of the crow rate came into effect 2 years ago, it pretty much sealed the line's fate. No longer would the rail line receive subsidies for hauling grain, so this branch line, along with many others throughout the prairies, were no longer viable. The Hammersmith subdivision was at a disadvantage in that it was not a through route. The line dead ends at Hammersmith. When the line was first built in 1909, it was originally planned to connect with the CPR line at Assiniboia, but for some unknown reason, it was never completed. Over the past 2 years, a series of town hall meetings were held in the community halls in the 4 towns between the locals and officials of the CPR. In addition, public hearings were held between those same officials and senior management of the various grain companies, but in the end, their pleas fell on deaf ears. A special interest group based in Hammersmith made an offer to purchase the rail line from CP Rail, but they were unable to secure additional funding from the provincial government. They underestimated the amount of capital expenditure required to operate the rail line, which would include locomotives, equipment, rolling stock, labor, and track maintenance. When the group presented their proposal to the provincial transportation minister, it was immediately rejected. When they reached the opposite end of the rail yard, Charlie opened the switch, which placed the locomotive on the main track for its line to Hammersmith. On the normal run, it would be carrying a fleet of empty boxcars and hopper cars, but since they would only be picking up fully loaded cars this time, they decided to travel straight through to Hammersmith and pick up all the cars on the way back. Their normal routine was to drop off the empty cars at the west switch of each town and pick up the full cars at the east switch on the return trip. Since they were the only traffic, they could park the train on the main track, unhook the locomotive, and reconnect once the additional rail cars were picked up. When hopper cars were introduced in the 70s as a means of transporting grain, they were considered to be a much more efficient means. They were less labor intensive to load and had a much greater capacity than the traditional boxcar. In order to prepare a boxcar for hauling grain, a process known as coopering had to be performed. It's obvious that barrel makers never got a copyright on their name. It involved taking a large sheet of cardboard with sheet metal slats, placing the sheet across the door, taking each slat individually and placing them through rungs along the wall, and nailing each slat in place. This was done inside the boxcar, so the elevator operator had to climb one ladder inside to get to the top of the cardboard sheet, and then climb over to a second ladder to get outside the boxcar. This was a very laborious process, which was further complicated in winter. It was very difficult to place the slats through the rungs while wearing heavy gloves. Loading boxcars was also a nuisance, as the spout had to be constantly shifted from one side of the boxcar to the other. Boxcars were also reputed to be a pain to unload at the grain terminals. Despite the convenience of hopper cars, most of the grain elevators along the Hammersmith line still used boxcars. Hopper cars did have one drawback. A fully loaded hopper car is double the weight of a fully loaded boxcar. This being a branch line, it still utilizes 85 pound per yard rail. By comparison, the CPR main line uses 130 pound per yard rail. Lighter rail means lighter maximum weight capacity. This was another argument which worked in favor of Canada's two major railways, stating that branch lines were becoming redundant. For Daryl and Charlie, their trip was not starting off on the right foot. 9 miles west of Weyburn was the first town along the line, the village of Crandall. The lone elevator operator, Albert Sims, was standing along the siding, waiting for them to pass by. When they did, he gave them a dirty look and flashed his middle finger. "What's his problem?" asked Charlie. "What do you expect? He's probably going to be out of a job," replied Daryl. "You would think he'd be about retirement age by now." "I'm not sure. Maybe he's just younger than he looks." Crandall was never more than a dot on the map. In fact, it was never incorporated a village. It was always a hamlet. The population never exceeded 50. Today, there are barely 10 people living there. It never had more than 2 grain elevators. The Pioneer elevator closed 10 years ago and was demolished the following year. The general store closed in 1984 after going through a series of different owners since the 60s. With Weyburn being only 9 miles away, the locals found it more convenient to drive there for all their goods and services. With no cars in tow and a long straight stretch in front of them, Daryl considered opening the throttle and see how fast this old locomotive could travel. Charlie responded by saying, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Daryl decided to comply and stick to the maximum speed limit of 15 miles per hour. With the infrequency of service over the past several years, the line has seen very little maintenance. In some places, the weeds were so tall that you were unable to see the tracks. The ties hadn't been replaced in ages, and some are so badly rotted they can barely hold the rails in place. Instead, Daryl seized the opportunity and reflected on his past 17 years of piloting trains along the rail line. Over the years, there were both good times and bad times. When he was first assigned to the Hammersmith subdivision in 1981, the grain elevators were operating at full capacity. Trains were operating daily, and often the trains were 24 cars long when they reached Weyburn. By the mid-80s, the combination of low grain prices and drought resulted in a few disastrous years. Prices rebounded by the early 90s, but by then, many farmers were unable to recover. One by one, the grain elevators started closing, and eventually runs of the Weyburn Tramp were reduced to 3 per week, sometimes 2 in the winter. Trains rarely exceeded 15 cars.